The rounds are coming from 800 meters up the slope, and every man in the element already knows the math. The enemy position is visible from the valley floor. Not clearly, not precisely, but enough. A fighting position in the rocks at the high edge of a ridgeline stepping down out of the Shah-i-Kot Valley in eastern Afghanistan. The kind of terrain where you can see a long way. And a long way means nothing when you can't reach it. The ranger with the M4 puts his red dot where the muzzle flash was. He squeezes. He squeezes again. He is not missing. The rounds are arriving, and the position keeps firing. Because 800 meters is not the outside edge of an M4. It is a different country. It is a place the enemy has calculated carefully, staked out patiently, and decided is safe. And the thing that makes it safe is wearing an American uniform. The war in Afghanistan in the spring of 2002 did not look like the wars America had spent 3 decades preparing for. It looked like the problem the M14 was made to solve. The fighters who survived the initial American air campaign in late 2001 did not retreat because they were broken. They withdrew because they had learned to read the Americans the way they had always read foreign armies, through terrain and distance. What they found when they studied the forces arriving in eastern Afghanistan was a specific number: 400 meters. That was the practical effective range of the M4 carbine against point targets in standard conditions. 14.5 inches of barrel, 6.5 pounds. A 5.56 NATO cartridge designed in the context of one specific war, optimized for one specific terrain, and carried into the mountains of Afghanistan by a military that had not yet been forced to reckon with how wrong that fit was. In Vietnam, where the 5.56 concept had been validated in blood and after-action reports, combat engagements rarely exceeded 100 meters. In Cold War Germany, the expected war was fast and mechanized, and distances were short. The entire American procurement logic from the 1960s through the 1990s was built on engagements inside 500 meters. The 5.56 round was lighter than 7.62. Soldiers could carry more of it. It was manageable and full automatic in the terrain that mattered. Every advantage the 5.56 had over its predecessor was a real advantage for the specific war the doctrine had been designed around. Afghanistan is not inside 500 meters. The mountain valleys of Paktia, Kunar, and Khost are places where ground itself does the fighting. Ridgelines sit at a kilometer. Valley floors sit exposed to fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The enemy fighters who occupied those ridgelines did not need to reverse engineer American weapons specifications. The mountains showed them everything. High ground and distance had blunted foreign armies in that terrain for a century. What every encounter at 800 meters was confirming, firefight by firefight, before and during Anaconda, was that the men below could not effectively return fire. Not because of altitude, because of range. The M4 had been built for a different kind of fight, and 800 meters was a kind of fight it was not built to win. They stood at 800 meters and fired down, and the American infantry firing back were not reaching them. This was not courage, it was terrain, and it was working. In the Shah-i-Kot Valley in March of 2002, Operation Anaconda cost 8 Americans their lives. Bad intelligence, rugged terrain, enemy positions more prepared than anyone expected to find, and distances. Engagements fought repeatedly at ranges that standard infantry equipment and training had not been built to handle. The enemy on those ridgelines did not need a strategic doctrine. They needed high ground and rifles that could reach the valley floor. Both were there waiting. The M14 had been in Army inventories since 1957. Springfield Armory built it as the definitive American service rifle of the Cold War. Gas-operated, rotating bolt, 20-round detachable magazine, chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO. A round with the mass and velocity to remain lethal and accurate past 800 meters in experienced hands. It replaced the M1 Garand. It was accurate, powerful, and built for the kind of full-power rifle engagement that Cold War doctrine had spent decades planning for. And it lasted less than a decade in frontline service. Vietnam broke the M14's future. Not in combat, but in doctrine. The war being fought in the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands demanded a short rifle, a light rifle, a rifle manageable in dense jungle at ranges under 100 meters. The M14 was 44 inches long. Its wooden stock absorbed humidity and swelled. Its automatic fire mode was nearly uncontrollable in close terrain. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, running the war through a framework of systems analysis, pushed the adoption of the M16, Eugene Stoner's 5.56 design. Half the weight, built for the terrain immediately in front of the Army. The M14 was pulled from frontline service by the late 1960s. By the early 1970s, it was in long-term storage. The Army had made a rational decision for a specific war, and then it forgot to revisit the decision when the terrain changed. That is not incompetence. That is what happens when a procurement system makes a correct argument and then treats the argument as permanent. That decision built a 30-year gap. The enemy in eastern Afghanistan had found it. In the fall of 2002, after the after-action reports from Operation Anaconda moved through the chain of command, the Rangers did not wait for a formal requirements document. They did not commission a study. They went to the warehouse. The M14 was there, a weapon declared obsolete, held in long-term storage, waiting in the kind of institutional limbo that government arsenals produce when they can't quite bring themselves to destroy something that still works. What the Rangers put back into the field was not always tidy. Early modifications were field practical rather than formally programmed. Scopes, accurized barrels, modified stocks, whatever produced reliable accuracy at the distances the mission demanded. The systematic chassis and optics programs came later. What mattered in those first deployments was not the furniture, it was the round. 7.62 by 51 millimeters NATO, unchanged from 1957, which was the reason for all of it. At 800 meters, the 7.62 round retained roughly 2.5 times the kinetic energy of a 5.56 round fired from an M4 at the same distance. The physics were not ambiguous. A trained marksman with a properly assembled M14 could engage accurately at 1,000 meters. He could stop the kind of threat that a full element of M4 carbines was watching helplessly from 700. The role the Rangers built around this rifle was called the Designated Marksman. One man per patrol, embedded in a standard Ranger element, his specific function to own the distance between 500 and 1,000 meters. Not a sniper worked in pairs, moved deliberately, planned hides over days. This man moved with his element and fought with his element. He carried the capability the element was missing. In practical terms, that meant carrying the only answer the element had. Every time a patrol took fire at distance, every man in the element who couldn't reach the threat turned in the same direction. To him. Every M4 had already fired. Every M4 had reached its limit. The Designated Marksman was the element's only remaining answer. One man, one rifle, 700 meters of open ground, and a problem that had been killing Americans since March. The weapon the Army had declared finished in the early 1970s had become, in eastern Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003, the only thing in the patrol that could close the gap the enemy had spent months building a doctrine around. That is the difference between obsolete and wrong. The M14 was not wrong. It was waiting for a war that looked like this one. Takur Ghar, March 4th, 2002. Elevation 10,240 feet. In the ridges above the Shah-i-Kot Valley, a mountain American forces came to call Roberts Ridge, after the SEAL who fell from his helicopter in the pre-dawn hours of that same morning. Navy SEAL Petty Officer First Class Neil Roberts had fallen from an MH-47 Chinook during a reconnaissance insertion that came apart when the helicopter took fire in the darkness. By the time Rangers from 1st Battalion 75th Ranger Regiment inserted to support the rescue effort at first light, al-Qaeda fighters had fortified the peak. Chalk 1 came down into the landing zone under direct fire. The Chinook took rocket-propelled grenades before it cleared the ground. Staff Sergeant Philip Svitak, a crew chief from the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, was killed in the initial contact. Specialist Mark Anderson was killed in the same opening seconds. The surviving Rangers fought out of the impact zone to cover. The terrain at Takur Ghar did not favor long-range engagement. The fight was close, violent, high altitude. The kind of combat where oxygen deprivation and cold and smoke combined into an ordeal that every survivor described differently. Specialist Matthew Commons died in the fighting on the peak. Sergeant Bradley Crows died holding a position long enough for others to withdraw. Technical Sergeant John Chapman, an Air Force combat controller who continued fighting alone at the top of that mountain after his element withdrew, was killed in action and later awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Technical Sergeant Jason Cunningham, a para-rescueman who continued treating the wounded while himself wounded, died before the fight ended. 7 Americans killed on one mountaintop in one morning. Takur Ghar did not produce a failure of courage. It produced some of the most significant valor awards of the early Afghanistan campaign from a single engagement across multiple services. The record of men who gave everything they had in conditions that would have broken lesser units. What it produced, past the grief and the accounting, was clarity. The enemy had chosen that ground with precision. The Americans had arrived with the inventory built for the previous war, and the two facts were related in a way that was not going to be resolved by additional courage. The Ranger Regiment did not wait for a formal procurement cycle. Unit leaders who had watched their men fire at unreachable enemies came back from the Shah-i-Kot and acted. M14 rifles were pulled from storage, scoped and modified, and handed to trained men. In operational areas across Khost and Kunar provinces in 2003, Ranger Designated Marksman engaged enemy positions at ranges the enemy had treated as safe, beyond 600 meters, where the M4 had already proven it couldn't reach. After-action reporting from Ranger operations during that period describes a consistent pattern. Enemy fighters occupying elevated terrain they had controlled freely, then taking accurate return fire from a weapon they had not factored into their calculations. The first time a Ranger-designated marksman engaged an enemy machine gun at the distances the enemy had counted on for protection and stopped that gun while every M4 in the element had already fired and failed, the price paid in the Shah-i-Kot became something other than a wound. It became operational knowledge. The gap the enemy had found was closed. The men who died at its edge were not forgotten. The gap was closed. In operational areas where Ranger patrols carried the M14 designated marksman capability, enemy fighters changed behavior. In interrogation reporting and recovered enemy communications from that period, American intelligence noted a pattern. The standoff doctrine was losing reliability in areas where a second rifle appeared in American patrol formations. When the 7.62 came back, pulled from a warehouse by Rangers who refused to accept the inherited consensus about what was finished, the doctrine lost the ground it was standing on. Not gradually, not eventually. The first time a designated marksman reached out past 600 meters and the enemy position went quiet, the entire calculus of standoff engagement in that area changed. The logic was unchanged. The application was dead. The M14 was not vindicated by a committee. It was vindicated because a Ranger looked at the distance between his element and the enemy, looked at his M4, and recognized that the weapon he was carrying had not been built for the war he was in. The systems analysts who declared the M14 finished were not wrong about Vietnam. They were wrong about the idea that one war's lessons could serve as a permanent answer. The weapon you need is not the weapon that won the last doctrinal argument. It is the weapon that solves the problem in front of you. Sometimes those are the same. Sometimes the answer has been sitting in a warehouse for 30 years, coated in storage grease, waiting for the men in the field to override the men in the meeting. The Rangers overrode the meeting. The M14 was officially obsolete. The enemy was officially safe at 800 meters. Both of those things stopped being true on the same day, for the same reason. The men with institutional authority to declare what was finished had made their decision. The men carrying the rifles in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan made a different one. And the mountains agreed with the Rangers. What the M14 says about American military culture is precise. The procurement system is not wrong to make decisions based on the war in front of it. It is wrong to treat those decisions as permanent. The lesson is not that old weapons are always better. It is that the men who carry the rifles into the actual terrain have standing to revise the consensus, always. And the record of American military history tends to side with them. The weapon the institution declares obsolete is finished only until it isn't. The Rangers knew it wasn't finished. They usually do. If that distinction between what an institution declares finished and what the man downrange knows works is what brought you here, subscribe. There is more.